As my title suggests, I'm going to be talking today about an issue in the metaphysics of ontological priority or relative fundamentality. And the way I'm going to introduce my talk is by reading out the introduction to somebody else's paper. So this is going to be a paper by Gabriel Oak Rabin called Grounding Orthodoxy and the Layered Conception. Now, this is a fabulous paper. It's one that I have really benefited from and cited and all that stuff. But it is quite representative of a lot of work in this genre overall. So let me read it out and then I'll say in what respect that's true. Our world contains a shocking variety of stuff, from the very large, planets, quasars, and galaxies, to the very small, quarks, leptons, and bosons, with lots in between, koalas, canyons, and coins. Here's a common thought. All this stuff can be organized into a hierarchy of levels. The galaxies and quasars are on top, the canyons and koalas are in the middle, below them come molecular compounds, and at the very bottom are the tiny particles and other phenomena, such as nuclear forces, that are discussed in fundamental physics. The idea of levels in the special sciences respects this hierarchical conception of the world. In the layering of these sciences, physics is at the bottom, then chemistry, then biology, then psychology, then economics, lying on the top. Let's use the phrase, the layered conception of reality, as a label for the general idea that reality is layered in a hierarchy structured by relations of dependence. Now, much philosophical ink has been spilled recently inquiring into the nature of ground. Ground is alleged to be a or the relation of metaphysical dependence, explanation, and or priority. It's that relation the physicalist alleges to hold between the mental and the physical, that the utilitarian claims holds between moral facts and facts about pleasure and pain, and that many claim to hold between the fact that P and the fact that P or Q. In each case, the ground makes the grounded obtain. And then what he does is he goes off and he gives a theory of a kind of general a logic for this relation of ground. So see what's happened here. The claim is we get a hierarchical picture of the world from the sciences. Sorry about the outside. This motivates the introduction of a relation of ground. This relation of ground is then taken to apply to stuff that only philosophers care about, right? Such as that, the relation between disjunctions and their disjuncts, or the relation between moral facts and facts about and psychological facts, right? And then he says, I will go on, right, to give a theory of this. Okay. So you see what's happening here. And now that I've pointed it out, you will see this happening all over the place. Science is being appealed to in order to motivate, and one hand cannot help but feel somehow legitimate, a much more general philosophical project in the metaphysics of ground. Now, insofar as this is indeed a motivational strategy, it is one that somebody like myself is primed to worry about. So it reminds me a bit of other sort of defensive strategies that metaphysicians have taken, right? Such as debates over methodologies. So you will find metaphysicians saying all theory selection in metaphysics comes about by kind of arguing over, picking theories with the best theoretical virtues, but scientists appeal to theoretical virtues all the time. Therefore, we get to do that too. Okay, everybody thinks science is great, so that's what they do. It's fine for us to do it as well. Now, many people have recently written a lot of stuff to problematize this legitimating strategy. So perhaps just to take one example, people like Michael Humer or Uriah Kriegel have noted that maybe what it means for a modern scientific theory, which is highly mathematicalized, to be simple is necessarily different from what it means for a metaphysical theory to be simple. And if that's the case, then whatever the structure of that inference is, it does not go through. Okay, I've actually argued something quite similar in my own work with regard to naturalistic metaphysics, the sort of thing that I do. So naturalistic metaphysicians are worried, for various reasons about the epistemic status of their activity. But you can find people saying things like, well, my metaphysics, unlike analytic metaphysics, is based in science, and that's making progress. So our metaphysics is making progress too. Right. And I would argue that actually the senses of progress involved here have to be different. So again, whatever the structure of that inference is, it really likely does not go through. So with that background, I am now starting to worry about the following questions or think about them. Does what it means to be ontologically prior to something differ between science and metaphysics? Relatedly, does what it means to ground or metaphysically explain something, does that differ between science and metaphysics? So this is sort of my new project. This talk is not as far along as I would like it to be. A couple of things have happened in the last couple of years to slow me down. But what I can say at the moment is the following. If you're a Humean, you must, and indeed you can, recognize a plurality of relations of metaphysical explanation. What I will claim is that the relation of metaphysical explanation that scientists give is different from the relation of metaphysical explanation that metaphysicians give. Now, this claim represents an incremental advance on what stuff that is already out there in the literature. It's going to build on my earlier work with Fred Muller on composition in physics. It relies heavily on some influential work by Barry Lower about explanation within Humeanism, and it's going to draw essentially on some new work by Harjit Bogal, which is kind of perfecting that lower strategy in the Humean context, and I'll say what that is. I should say too, this argument that I'm going to give you is similar to that given by Nina Emery in her influential paper, Laws Ground Their Instances. You could basically add what Harjit Bogal says to Nina's paper, and you would come out, I think, with the same conclusion. But I hope that some of you will agree that there's some value added by thinking about the issue as I do, namely through the lens of composition. And hopefully this is an interesting conclusion. Certainly, I think it's one that has a kind of normative import insofar as, to some extent, this big G grounding project in metaphysics is motivated by something going on in science. If these are different relations, different, they have different meanings, then presumably there's some normative significance to this project, and I'll say a little bit about what that is. And I know that many of you are Humeans, so I hope that many of you care about this or think about this. However, I'm not sure what I should make of it because I am not a Humean. And as I will argue, there's absolutely nothing in this argument that I give that should give that has any relevance outside of the Humean context. So what I want to close by doing is just considering whether the anti-Humean, there are other routes that are available to get at the same conclusion that don't presuppose this kind of Humean metaphysical background. So just some clarifications before I get going with that. My claim is going to be that if you're a Humean, you should think that the metaphysical explanations that scientists give are different from those that metaphysicians give. It follows from this that I think scientists give metaphysical explanations, right? I do think that. I don't think there's any contradiction in that. The reason is that I'll take the claim X metaphysically explains Y to mean more or less that X grounds Y. I'll take that as pretty much synonymous. Grounding is referred to as the level connector. As Schaffer says, as causation connects the world across time, grounding connects the world across levels. So it follows what you're doing when you give a metaphysical explanation is you're giving a level connecting explanation. And I think scientists do that all the time. So I think this is fine. I should say also that I'll be kind of talking in the same breath about pluralism about metaphysical explanation and pluralism about ontological priority. Now, these are not the same claim. Clearly, they are, however, closely related because most people think that to be ontologically secondary is to be metaphysically explained somehow. Nevertheless, they are different claims. In fact, this is one of the takeaways from that nice paper by Gabrielle Ribin that I mentioned. Nevertheless, I'm going to just kind of flip between the two. If I was writing it, I'd be a little more circumspect, but I'm not going to be that. Okay, so here's the structure, and sorry that my section headings have disappeared off the top of the screen. In part two, I'll give a quick and dirty argument for why you should be a pluralist about priority. It's not going to work, but it's going to help put on the table visually the picture that I want you to have in your heads. And then I'm going to argue that if you're a Humean, you need to buy into something like that picture. And then just to close out, I'll say what we might say to non-Humeans to try and motivate the same point of view. Okay, so here is a quick and dirty argument for the plurality of priority. What I'm going to claim is that this kind of pluralism is very naturally suggested by our usual ways of talking in the metaphysics of science. And to make this point, I'm going to appeal very kind of closely to two papers by Jonathan Schaffer. Now, the reason I'm doing this is not because I think that Jonathan Schaffer has a monopoly on how we should think about these issues. I'm going to do it because everything that he says is scrutinized and picked over, and the things in his papers that I'm going to be relying on don't seem to be things that other people have really taken issue with. So I'm going to sort of take that as a reason to think that lots of people think about things along these lines. It's a natural way for metaphysicians to think. So let me start with this 2003 paper, Is There a Fundamental Level? One that's been very important to my own work. The purpose of that paper is to argue that the question of whether or not there's a fundamental level to reality is an empirical question. Okay, as he puts it, the existent structure and number of the levels of nature cannot be intuited from the armchair. Now, he takes it as a given that it is the empirical sciences that tell us in this paper, he takes it as a given that we look to the empirical sciences to tell us what the contents of the levels of nature are. The kind of innovation of this paper is to argue that empirical consideration should also tell us about these facts about its logical structure, and in particular that it is well-founded, whether it's not well-founded or not. So to be clear, the kind of levels that he is concerned with in this paper are what he calls the levels of nature. These are the sort of thing that's investigated by empirical science. So here's what he says. The central connotation of the levels metaphor is that of a mereological structure ordered by the part-whole relation. This connotation is implicit in Newton's talk of the smallest particles and in the cliche of fundamental building blocks. It's in Oppenheim and Putnam's use of part-whole relations to distinguish micro from macro theory. The peripheral connotations of levels include those of B, a supervenient structure, C, a realization structure ordered by functional relations, and D, a nomological structure ordered by one-way bridge principles between families of lawfully related properties. Those who speak of levels typically suppose that most, if not all of these connotations comport. And I'll say about what that means in a moment. So for now, I want to say that he says that there are different ways of thinking about levels of nature. And there are different relations that we use to stake out relations between levels of nature, A through D. Now I'm going to ignore supervenience here, right? This was written in 2003. People generally don't use supervenience to get at priority structure anymore. But what I want to say now is that the remaining connotations of the levels hierarchy most naturally apply to individuals of different metaphysical categories. So our mereological structure most naturally applies to the category of objects, right? Such that objects are going to be less fundamental to the extent that they are mereologically complex. A realization structure clearly most naturally applies to properties, right? A property is going to be less fundamental to the extent it's realized by others. And of course, the nomological structure, right? Relations of derivation using bridge principles, this clearly applies to laws, right? Laws of nature. So we can sort of represent what's going on, different ways of thinking about the levels of nature. We've got, I call these intracategorical hierarchies. We've got objects related by mereological relations, properties related by, I shouldn't point, you can't see me point, properties related by realization relations, and laws related by some kind of relation of derivation. Okay, these are the hierarchies that science discovers. And they are, in the first instance at least, they stake out relations of priority between members of the same category. So he then goes on to say that these relations comport. Most people think that. And so what that means is that more or less fundamental properties are had by more or less fundamental objects, which enter into more or less fundamental laws. So we can take these three hierarchies and we can sort of throw a lasso around them. And what we end up with is something that I can represent this way. This is my hierarchy of levels of nature. These levels are still ultimately defined by relations of priority between members of the same category. It's just that if these comportment, we can find relations between these relations as well. Okay, so I'm going to assume there's a fundamental level of nature to make things easier, even though he argues in this paper that you shouldn't necessarily believe that. I don't think that argument works, but in any case, we'll put that to the side. I'm just going to assume there's a fundamental level. And the next thing I'm going to assume is that, as per comportment, in the fundamental level, one finds the fundamental objects, the fundamental properties, and the fundamental laws. right? This is actually a less controversial assumption than this assumption about general comportment all the way up the hierarchy. I think this is close to what Mike Hicks and Jonathan Schaffer refer to in one of a very nice recent paper, the BGPS. We call it a kind of orthodoxy in metaphysics. They've got some quotes that kind of support that. So I'm going to assume that the fundamental level, get fundamental objects, fundamental properties, fundamental laws. So in this world, perhaps those are quarks with their colors, evolving in accordance with the laws of quantum chromodynamics. That is our best, but the only real candidate for a truly fundamental theory right now. Okay. I'm going to put that to the side for now, and we'll come back to it momentarily. I want to move on now to presenting some aspects of a kind of better known, very, very influential paper by Jonathan Schaffer, the 2009 on what grounds what. So this is this very, very widely cited paper in which he argues that metaphysics, as I understand it, is about what grounds what. It is about the structure of the world. It is about what is fundamental and what derives from it. So this kind of like launching this kind of manifesto about how we do metaphysics from now on. So one of his claims in this paper is that Aquinian approach to metaphysics must be replaced by a kind of neo-Aristotelian one based on hierarchy in nature if we're going to make sense of canonical debates in metaphysics. So as he says, the philosopher raised on the Quine-Carnap debate who turns to central metaphysical questions will leave confused. She will find debates such as 1, metaphysical realism versus idealism, 2, realism about numbers versus constructivism, 3, realism about universals versus nominalism, 4, substratum versus bundle theories of objects, 5, dualistic versus materialistic theories of mind, 6, substantival versus relational theories of space, and 7, monistic versus pluralistic theories of the cosmos. Here she will find little disagreement about what exists, but profound dispute over what is fundamental. So I'm not going to discuss whether I think you could make sense of this on the Quine-Carnap picture. All I want to draw your attention to today is that many of these, indeed the highlighted ones here, these are disputes about the relative priority of ontological categories. So for example, debate 3, universals versus nominalism, you can think of as the debate about whether we need universals as a fundamental category in addition to a category of objects. Substratum versus bundle theories of objects asks whether we need objects as a fundamental category in addition to the category of properties, I take it. And substantival versus relational theories of space is likewise a kind of debate about whether you need both relations and space-time points in your ontology, or maybe just whether one of them will do. Okay, and I think that to this list, we really probably have to add another, which is the debate over the nature of laws, right? Certainly for metaphysicians of science, most of us think of this as probably the central debate in the metaphysics of science. And in fact, it was Schaffer who is credited, if that's the right word, with integrating the debate over laws, how to think about laws with this language of grounding, right? So he says in another paper for the Humean, laws are grounded in, based on, and nothing over and above history, which is of course for the Humean, the mosaic of perfectly natural fundamental physics properties. Okay, so we can see that as a debate about, do you need properties, do you need laws in your ontology as well as these properties, or can you, or are laws the secondary category as the Humean thinks? Okay, so let me put now these two papers together. It seems that part of the business of metaphysics is to determine which categories are prior to what, which categories are fundamental, which are derivative. This is going to define for us a kind of levels structure, right? Hierarchy of levels, and call the level structure that is so determined the levels of metaphysics. These are contrasted with levels of nature, which are naturally construed as concerning the members of these categories. And as we know, it's empirical scientists that we turn to determine those, right? That's just putting those two papers together. Now, add in another very common assumption or common claim, uncontroversial, I think, that metaphysicians are primarily interested in determining the fundamental categories. Okay, so this is a paper I'll come back to in a bit, but this paper by Laurie Paul, Metaphysics as Modeling, The Handmaid's Tale. There she writes, physics tells us which fundamental physical objects, structures, and properties are the actual fundamental members of the ontological categories. And metaphysics takes it a level deeper by telling us what the fundamental categories are. Okay. So It's about looking for those fundamental categories. Now, presumably, if you want to determine what those are, you should look, if you want your metaphysics to be guided by science, certainly, if it sounds like she is here, you should look into that fundamental level that physics gives us with, the actual fundamental objects, properties and laws and the relations between them. Look at that stuff to determine what the fundamental categories are out there. So with the picture that we're getting at so far, this is an initial sketch, something like this. So here we have the levels of nature. I'm going to take these levels to be connected by a level connector or priority relation, call it Ln. And what the metaphysician is doing is looking into the fundamental level there and determining what the levels of metaphysics should be on that basis. So to determining a kind of levels, a hierarchy of levels within metaphysics, right? So let Lm be the level connector between the levels of metaphysics, which, as I've said, connect one category to another. So this is a nice picture. It kind of very suggestive about how metaphysics contributes to the scientific project. You know, the holy grail of physics, you might think, is to find a fundamental theory, determine what the fundamental level is like. What metaphysics is doing is telling us, well, what's fundamental to that? So it's kind of required to kind of complete or round out the scientific project. And I do believe that. I really do think that philosophy has, you know, is kind of needed to finish the goals that physicists set themselves. But what I'm kind of want to think about more now is how exactly do we take these two level connectors to be related to one another? How should I think about the priority relations that connect levels of nature to those that connect levels of metaphysics? And this being a quick and dirty argument, I'm going to try and kind of communicate this by thinking about it in a kind of visual kind of idiom. Right? How are they oriented? How are these two levels connectors oriented with respect to one another? Suppose that the level connector in metaphysics is oriented somehow parallel to that of the level connector connecting levels of nature. Then it seems to me that what the metaphysician has to say is that the more fundamental category is located at a lower level of nature than the less fundamental category is. Okay. So for example, I think that it's right to say that on this picture, somebody like the Humean is going to say that what we thought was the fundamental level of nature is actually, that's not right. The fundamental properties occupy a lower level of nature than that level of nature occupied by the fundamental laws. Okay, I think they're committed to saying that. And the reason is that if we keep fundamental laws and fundamental properties in the same level of nature, there's just no way to distinguish them by means of a level connector that's oriented in the same direction as the levels of nature themselves, right? There's no distance in this direction. We can't think about these two relations of priority as oriented in that way. However, we said that we started off with this, what we call the orthodoxy, which says that quarks, color, and laws of QCD, they're all there in the fundamental level, okay? So given that orthodox assumption, it seems that we cannot have this kind of parallel orientation, right? It seems that rather we have to think about the kind of the hierarchy of levels of metaphysics as being somehow orthogonal to the hierarchy of levels of nature. So the picture that we get is rather it's sort of something like this, okay? So on this picture, we leave the fundamental level of nature as it is. The physics describes for us a fundamental level of nature with its objects, properties, and laws doing their thing together. Metaphysical analysis leaves that level intact, but nevertheless, it finds structure in a sort of another dimension within that fundamental level. Okay. They find structure along a different dimension, right? So you might think just as two impressions in our visual field can have exactly the same frequency and yet differ with respect to their brightness, which is why we talk about color as being this 2 or 3-dimensional sort of structure. The picture that we get, I think the most natural picture for metaphysics is one in which we leave the fundamental level intact and we just find structure along this different dimension. And you might think that's well and good, right? It's not the business of the metaphysician to tell the scientist how the levels of nature are oriented with respect to one another. They're engaged in this other thing. Now, if that was right, if this is the right way to think about things, then the people, and this is a quote from the Rabin paper, people use this definite article, the hierarchical conception of the world. It's a bit of a misnomer. really the hierarchy of nature is a two-dimensional structure, at least, with a plurality of priority relations. I think that's the most natural way to think about what's going on. And if that's right, it's interesting, right? It's just interesting as a metaphysician to understand what the world's priority structure is. That's for Jonathan Schaffer, that's what metaphysics is all about. But it might also help us resolve certain debates or make better sense of certain debates in metaphysics. So it might help us understand what we mean in, like the ontic structural realist says when they say that elementary particles such as electrons, or sorry, yeah, fundamental particles such as electrons are not really fundamental. It's like, well, what does that mean? When we bring in this other dimension, we can make those sort of seeming contradictions go away. And it might be helpful in other bits of philosophy of physics, maybe understanding the relation between particles and fields. Maybe you think of electrons sort of as particles, a quanta of the electron field. They're fundamental members of the category of particles, but maybe not fundamental on the levels of metaphysics or something. I don't know. So I think this is an interesting picture and one that I think we should take seriously. However, I think you will agree that I haven't done a very good job of really arguing for it, because, you know, we're all rested on this assumption about the orthodoxy, that all of these things, quarks, colors, and QCD laws are all in the fundamental level. Maybe we should just give that up. Maybe the work of the metaphysician really does affect a kind of splitting of the fundamental level, such that the fundamental level of properties is, in fact, located at a lower level than the fundamental level of laws. Now, if that was the case, we'd have an analogy to something that went on in particle physics or in atomic physics, with the ground state of hydrogen, which is going to make a cameo again in a few minutes. So people thought they had found the ground state of hydrogen, the lowest energy state of hydrogen, but then they brought in more units of analysis. They incorporated nuclear and electron spin. And lo and behold, it turns out that wasn't the most fundamental level. It split into two other levels, one of which was higher and one of which was lower than the level that they thought they started out with. For all I know, that's what metaphysicians are doing. So if I really want to motivate this sort of rich two-dimensional picture, I think I have to work a little bit harder. So what I want to claim now is that if you're a Humean, you have to be committed to that kind of picture, right? You need to recognize this plurality of relations of metaphysical explanation and a kind of two-dimensional structure in your metaphysics. And I want to argue this by appeal to what Schaffer called the central connotation of levels of nature, that is mereological structure. And my starting point for this argument is going to be a little paper I wrote, although lots of other people have written at around the same time actually came up with the same kind of proposal. But my own version was with Fred Muller, called Bound States and the Special Composition Question. So as I'm sure you know, Peter van den Wagen asked the question, under what conditions can two objects be said to compose a further object? And it's had a variety of answers. We suggested that the best, and certainly most naturalistically acceptable answer to that question was that we should recognize a composite in addition to a couple of relatively simple entities when and only when those simples form a bound state with one another, right? That was our bound state proposal. Okay, so just to give a little background for those not familiar here, a set of particles are said to be in a bound state when their total energy is strictly less than zero. How does that happen? Well, their energy is a sum of their kinetic and potential energy. An attractive potential is associated with negative energy, right? This is because you have to do work to stop them kind of coming together from infinity. And so then to say that a set of particles are in a bound state is to say that the kind of energy keeping them together, binding them together, exceeds the kinetic energy that would just over time, you sort of a priori expect them to drift apart. And so particles in a bound state retain a kind of spatial proximity over time. Now, this has a certain amount of plausibility. We think it has a certain amount of extensional adequacy, at least. So for example, the particle zoo of hadrons that physicists recognize, they're all bound states of quarks, either three quarks or a quark and an antiquark. Right, so here's a slide from a physics lecture. We've got the mesons, quark-antiquark pairs. These are bound states of quarks, antiquarks. And the baryons are three quark bound states, right? And that's the structure that we use to build up the beautiful particle zoo, all very systematic, the omega minus and the sigma particles and the kind of taxonomy of particles that have been recognized in particle physics since the 60s. They're all bound states, right? And these are all entities that we discover, that we think exist, that we christen with names and so on. So if that's right, if that is how you should think about what a composite entity is in physics, or those are the conditions in which you should reify a composite, it follows that the composite entities are not mere mereological sums or fusions of their parts. And this is, I think, unless I misunderstand, which I may, but I think this is something that has been, certainly is clarified, at least in kind of more enlightened, more scientifically informed metaphysicians. So for example, Ted Sider says, the fact that there exists an atom of hydrogen is grounded in the fact that there exists an electron and a proton bonded to one another, right, in a bound state, in other words. So this fact about binding then is presumably part of the metaphysical explanation of the hydrogen atom, right? The hydrogen atom exists because you have these two particles that are bound to one another. Right? There's your answer. That's how the levels are connected. However, while that is part of the metaphysical explanation of the hydrogen atom, it's by no means where scientists stop with the explanation of the hydrogen atom, because why some particles are bonded, why they admit of bound states, is a critically important, pretty central scientific question, right? So physicists ask themselves all the time, why do you get a quark and an antiquark in a bound state and not two quarks? This is the sort of thing you can find discussed all the time in sort of pretty elementary particle physics textbooks. However, these questions can be extremely challenging. And as in fact, I'm sure many of you know, classical physics is actually completely unable to account for the existence of the hydrogenic bound state. And this will be important to me, so let me spend a few minutes on why this is. So in classical physics, so think about your picture of a hydrogen atom. You've got a proton, or got a proton at the center, an electron rotating around it. According to classical physics, that rotation is going to cause the electron to lose energy and it's going to collapse into the nucleus, right? In contradiction with the idea that it's kind of orbiting around it at some sort of finite separation from the nucleus. So here's how a textbook at the time put it. Were classical physics right, we should have charges of opposite sign continually rushing together, and when once together, no force would ever be adequate to separate them. Thus, the matter in the universe would tend to shrink into nothing or to diminish indefinitely in size. The observed permanence of matter, right, precludes any such hypothesis, like stuff taking up space, sitting around for a period of time. This seems to be in complete contradiction with what classical physics is telling you. So as a leading contemporary theorist of this issue, Elliot Lieb puts it, the inability to account for stable atoms in terms of classical trajectories of point-like charged particles was the major problem of pre-quantum physics, a problem so great that it caused some serious people to question their existence, or at least to question the nice pictures drawn by chemists. So what he's saying there is that at this time, it was so unclear how you would get composite structures out of atoms, that people were quite willing to question within the framework of classical physics, people were actually quite willing to question the existence of atoms at all, right? Atoms in the first place. So remember, it was only 1905 when you had the experiments of Perrin that made that the kind of scientific orthodoxy. People were quite open to having to give this up again, right? If you just can't account for how matter sticks together. Right, maybe move to energeticism, back to Oswald's program, something like that. These are the ideas that were in the air. Nobody knew how to solve the problem. Now, it's taken to have been really one of the first sort of major triumph of quantum mechanics is that it actually figured this one out. And so for quantum mechanics to solve the problem of accounting for the existence of hydrogen, it's got to do a couple of things. It's got to show that its central dynamical object, namely the Schrodinger equation, which looks like this. So here we have a Hamiltonian, which is composed of a kinetic term and a potential term. This is the electrostatic attraction, the 1 over r squared part. When this thing acts on a wave function appropriate to electron and proton at some distance r from one another, this thing has a solution, right? There's some number, well-defined number that you can put on the right-hand side, right? And moreover, that number is negative, that the energy that you associate thing is negative. It's a bound state. And this was, I'm not going to prove this here because it's pretty, I'm not even going to show you because it's pretty involved. It was ultimately proved utilizing quantum uncertainty principles, which are law-like statements within quantum mechanics. So as Lee puts it, the main contribution of quantum mechanics was to provide a quantitative theory that explains why the electron cannot fall into the nucleus. In brief, when the electron is close to the nucleus, its kinetic energy, which could be zero classically, is forced to increase in such a way that the total energy goes to positive infinity as the average distance between the two goes to zero, right? So as the two get closer, and the potential energy gets arbitrarily large, the kinetic energy also increases in such a way as to keep everything nice and finite, right? This property is known as the uncertainty principle. Okay, so it's a real triumph. Nothing obvious about how to do this. This is a real scientific achievement that they could figure this out. And these other nice results here as you dig around. So you can show, for example, that if you were to slot into that Hamiltonian a potential of the form 1 over r cubed or 1 over r to the 4 or whatever for any 1 over rn with n greater than 2, then it will not have a lowest energy state, right? It does not have a solution. So it seems that laws in quantum mechanics, so quantum mechanics can, yes, account for the existence of a bound state of the hydrogen atom, but they have to have quite specific forms in order for there to be said to be any composite objects at all. Okay, so it seems then metaphysicians take a hydrogen atom to be metaphysically explained by the existence of an electron and a proton bonded to one another. Scientists seem to take things a step further by explaining why they are bonded, which is going to involve features of the laws. What are the laws that the two particles accord with? So it seems to me, right, that facts about the laws, their form, right, in many different dimensions, form part of the metaphysical explanation of the existence of composites, right? When you think about composites as bound states, this is almost trivially true. So one thing I can say is it seems that scientists offer us explanations that are at once scientific insofar as they are giving us them, but also metaphysical, right? They're level connecting. They tell us why, given these two entities, you have this further entity as well. So this will be the only snarky thing I say in this talk. Some things that metaphysicians say I don't understand here, right? I'm going to continue reading this quote from Laurie Paul. Right. Physics tells us what fundamental physical objects, structures, and properties are the actual members of the ontological categories. Metaphysics takes it a level deeper by telling us what the fundamental categories are, and she continues, and by adding any needed supporting properties and relations, such as identity, ground, composition, etc. She continues, the scientist may tell us that the constituents of a cell are certain molecules and bonds arranged in a particular way. While the metaphysician may tell us that these constituents are arranged in this way, make the cell in virtue of composing the cell. That is, they tell us what it is for the molecules and bonds to be constituents of the cell, right? I cannot understand any of this. To be clear, I think that figuring out how there exists a composite object given simples was a scientific achievement. All of this work was done by scientists. I think metaphysics as science is really important, but I don't think we can take credit for this. Maybe I misunderstand what's being said here, but I can't understand this. This was a huge scientific achievement and at once a metaphysical one. However, it probably will be clear to those of you who are familiar with some of this literature that this, if I'm right about this, then this is something that causes a big problem for Humeanism. The reason is that, as I'm sure you know, for the Humean, laws are grounded, at least as many people think of these days, people think about Humeanism, laws are grounded in the Humean mosaic of particular fact, right? They're not primitive, they arise as the best systematization of the mosaic of the, perfectly natural properties. Okay, that's the thought. Lots to say for it, but it gives rise to a circularity worry. So many people have said this, but I'll give what Tim Waddlen says. If one is a Humean, then the Humean mosaic itself appears to admit of no further explanation. Since it is the ontological bedrock in terms of which other existent things are to be explicated, none of these further things can really account for the structure of the mosaic itself. The complaint then is that one cannot then appeal to those very laws to explain the particular features of the mosaic. The laws are what they are in virtue of the mosaic rather than vice versa. Okay. Now, this is an objection because scientists use laws to explain features of the mosaic all the time, right? Why is it that that organisms tend to develop cancer after following exposure to large amounts of radiation. Why does this property routinely follow that property? Well, scientists can explain that. They explain it in terms of laws of biology, laws of physics. But that means that they're using laws to explain features of the mosaic. Why this thing follows that all over the place, right? And so it seems that we're using laws to, scientists are using laws to explain the mosaic, but metaphysicians are explaining, are using the mosaic to explain the laws. Okay, and obviously that looks really circular. Now, there's a well-known response to this by Barry Lohr. So in his paper, I think it's 2 Accounts of Laws and Time, he says the following. This objection rests on failing to distinguish metaphysical explanation from scientific explanation. On Lewis's account, the Humean mosaic metaphysically determines the laws. It metaphysically explains why specific propositions are laws. This metaphysical explanation does not preclude the laws playing the usual role in scientific explanation. Right, he says it's only by confusing the 2 kinds of explanation that one would ever have thought that there was some kind of worry here. Now, Barry Lohr is not, I think he chooses his words carefully, but he is not clear on what the distinction between scientific and metaphysical explanation, this distinction that's supposed to save the day, he's not clear what this distinction amounts to. He does say things like scientific explanation of a particular event or fact need not show that it's grounded in a more fundamental event or fact, but rather typically shows why the event occurred in terms of prior events or laws. He doesn't use this term, I don't know why, but it certainly seems from this that it's causal explanation that's the paradigm of scientific explanation, right? Causation is that connects the world across time, after all. But it's clear from this wording here that he leaves open that other kinds of explanation may also count as scientific. In any case, whatever exactly this distinction is supposed to consist in, the claim is that as a result of this distinction between scientific and metaphysical explanation, the objection, the circularity objection, falls apart. However, it's not clear, or it should be pretty clear, that this move is not going to work. Now, obviously, in this context here. Why is this? Well, the explanation that I gave of the existence of hydrogen, this made appeal to laws, right? The fact that the laws are quantum mechanical. If they weren't, if they were classical, we wouldn't have hydrogen. The fact that the electrostatic potential has has a form, a particular form when, 1/r to the n for any n greater than 2, wouldn't give rise to these, wouldn't give rise to bound states. So the fact that the electrostatic potential and the fact that the law has a certain form and the fact that the laws are quantum mechanical, this is crucial to the explanation of the existence of hydrogen given its parts. But then, if that's the case, then laws feature in a metaphysical explanation as well as in a scientific one. So yes, it's an explanation that scientists give us, but it's a metaphysical explanation at the same time, right? It's level connecting. Okay. Moreover, I should be clear, the explanation of hydrogen qua a bound state is simultaneously an explanation of a part of the manifold, right? When I said that we are explaining hydrogen, that means we have to explain the existence of a bound state. A bound state is one that retains spatial proximity over time, right? When you tell me what the bound states are, when you tell me what the composite objects are, you're telling me something about the manifold, that these properties tend to cohere in time with these ones, okay? So, right, it seems we are using laws to explain facts about the manifold, and that's a metaphysical explanation. And also for the Humean, we use facts about the manifold to explain the laws, and that's also a metaphysical explanation. So we cannot use this kind of Lohr's distinction between the 2 kinds of explanation to get around the problem. However, the Humean can, it seemed to me, avoid the circularity worry if they distinguish 2 distinct forms of metaphysical explanation, one that relates the categories and one that relates the members of categories, right? One that connects levels of nature, one that connects levels of metaphysics, to put it in my earlier terminology. Okay, so if they can distinguish between these 2 forms of metaphysical explanation, then they are out of the woods, it seems. Certainly if Lohr's strategy works, then they're out of the woods. However, must does not imply can here. Just because they would need to distinguish these 2 forms of explanation doesn't mean that we have any sort of non-ad hoc reason to distinguish them. So this is a point that Nina Emery makes in her paper when she discusses this issue, a similar issue. So here I want to reach to this sort of, and I'll be very brief here. I know that you're here, Harjeet, so I hope I don't murder your paper. But this is wonderful paper by Harjeet Bogal called Nomothetic Explanation and Humanism about Laws of Nature, in which he argues that we can generally distinguish between scientific and metaphysical forms of explanation in terms of what they aim to do. Right, as he says, scientific explanation generally aims at unification, but clearly the explanation of laws by Humeans does not aim at this. Right, so when you give an explanation by unification, you take like one sort of relatively neat thing and you use it to explain all sorts of different phenomena. Whatever the Humean is doing with laws, it's not that. We take this really like unimaginably big junky thing and use that to explain this one little simple thing, right? That, what the, the laws of nature that you can write in a cheat sheet and put up your sleeve when you go into your physics exams, right? The two kinds of explanation are just fundamentally different. So that is really what Harjeet's doing. He's writing in defense of lower strategies to some opposition by Mark Lang, where Mark Lang says, a scientific explanation and a metaphysical explanation are both explanations. So you put them together and you just have one giant explanation that's circular, right? What he's saying is that actually it's kind of, if the two kinds of explanations have different aims, then you can't conjoin explanations. It's a kind of non-monotonic thing. You can't conjoin explanations to be said to have an explanation overall, right? Because there's no aim that's associated with the explanation. So it's a clever defense. I'm not going to go into the details here. All I want to say is that this strategy that Harjeet takes there helps the Humean in this context, because it seems that at once metaphysical and scientific explanation of hydrogen certainly performs a kind of unification, right? This explanation, people talk about quantum mechanics eating chemistry with a spoon, showing how you get stable composite objects, how you get bound states out of the Schrodinger equation, is just a huge part of the kind of reductionist worldview that this kind of connotes all this big kind of unified project. You have this one structure that explains all sorts of different phenomena, right? And as I've said, the Humean explanation of the laws in terms of the manifold of properties is absolutely doesn't have that going for it. As such, it seems that we can distinguish the two forms of metaphysical explanation that are in play here in terms of their aims, right? The one that connects levels of nature aims at a kind of unification. The one that connects levels of metaphysics, it does not. Hence, we can distinguish them. Okay. So it seems to me then that the Humean can and should recognize a plurality of forms of metaphysical explanation. And this, once you have this on the table, I think this gives rise to some interesting questions or dialectical possibilities, right? So most of the work on grounding is people sort of arguing that somebody says grounding necessarily has to have this feature, and then somebody finds a counterexample, and then we argue about that. If we say that there's a bunch of different relations of metaphysical explanation or grounding, then maybe we can have it both ways. Maybe one has to be well-founded, say, and the other one doesn't. Maybe levels of nature don't have to be well-founded, but levels of metaphysics sure the hell had better. Perhaps there's other possibilities. Perhaps you want to say that there's some real hard objective facts about what the sort of relations between the categories are. A priori, totally intersubjective and whatever, but maybe the levels of nature that are discovered by scientists that have all sorts of different aims, maybe they are not so objective. But there's all sorts of ways, I think, to play around with this. And also, just to go back to the initial normative point, the fact that the two kinds of relations of metaphysical explanation, that across levels of nature, that across levels of metaphysics, at least within the Humean picture, the fact that they're different really does underline that somebody can be perfectly happy with talk about ontological priority insofar as we get it from the sciences, and still be quite skeptical about a lot of the work that goes on in the metaphysics of grounding. Okay, maybe you could be that anyway, but it gives you a new way of kind of justifying that kind of point of view. Okay, so as I said, if you're Humean, I hope that you can have some fun with that picture or think about it. Of course, it might be wrong, but if it's not, I think there's interesting stuff that we can do with it. However, I should say I'm not a Humean. I'm not sure what I am actually. I see the arguments on both sides. I'm not going to say I'm a Humean. And there really seems to be nothing in this argument that non-humans should care about. For one thing, only humans get caught up in the circularity that forces us to distinguish the relations of metaphysical explanation. Non-humans are not trying to explain laws in terms of features of the mosaic, so the circularity doesn't get going, given that we use laws to explain all sorts of features of the mosaic, including why electrons and protons like to hang around with each other. Furthermore, arguably, only humans have different aims explicitly with respect to explanation in science and explanation in metaphysics. That was that key point from Harjeet's paper, which allows us to distinguish them. So we know that they need to distinguish them, but allows the human to distinguish these relations of explanation. In fact, somebody like Armstrong takes it as a strong point of his anti-Humean, in some sense, theory, that he is employing, in arguing for his theory, he's employing a relation of explanation that's just like that which scientists use. It's kind of inference to the best explanation. That's how you get to the big magic N, right, that relates universals. So, he's not he's using the same kinds of explanatory strategies that he says he's using the same kind of explanatory strategies to arrive at his metaphysics that scientists themselves use. And as we've said, the Humean is definitely not doing that. So there's really nothing in this argument that it seems non-Humeans should care about. So is there anything that we can say that might motivate this pluralism to non-Humeans? So this will just be the last thing I say. And it's a bit of it's a little bit of a downer, and I'm happy to be talked out of this, but so let's start by noting that there are a variety of non-Humean positions, and if very, very nice, I have to say, summary of these different positions is given in Tyler Hildebrand's 2020 Compass article on non-Humanism about laws of nature. Actually discusses this issue in a way that's I found extremely helpful in this particular context. I recommend it to you, but there he enumerates there are various kinds of non-Humean positions, like Maudlin's primitivism, Dretske-Tully-Armstrong necessitation, like giant N theory, dispositional essentialism, divine command theory, and he talks about the various virtues and the kind of dialectics there. The question I'm interested in is, well, let me say first of all that it's something, I don't know what it is about Humeanism, anti-Humeanism, that makes it so, maybe this is obvious, but it seems like there's more of a variety of non-Humean positions out there on the market than there are Humean positions. Like if you're a Humean these days, you just buy into something like some variant of David Lewis's theory. There's a few more options on the market when it comes to anti-Humeanism. And here's a question, right? Why is there more pronounced underdetermination in metaphysics than in science? So pretty much all scientists, I think, agree on what the explanation of hydrogen is as a bound state. Might just show you the maths, give you the evidence. Metaphysics is famously not like that. Even if you're an anti-Humean, anti-Humans don't agree about how to think about laws. People more broadly, disagree about those guys disagree about how to account for regularities, and more broadly, people disagree about whether regularities need to be accounted for at all. Why is this? So the standard lore here, this is maybe from quite all over the place, but a recent nice expression of this point of view was Anjan Chakravarty's new book, Scientific Ontology. The standard lore here is that metaphysics is a greater kind of empirical distance than science. It's less disciplined by the lab, so there's more room for speculation to be sort of rife, and that kind of leads to greater underdetermination. But here's the closing thought. Could it be something about the quality of the explanations that metaphysics provides in comparison with those of science that is in part what accounts for this, right? So here's a closing quote. Just as I opened with a long quote, I'll close with a long quote. This is Karl Hafer writing in a paper for fundamentalism, right? He's arguing against Nancy Cartwright's dappled view. He says, working through the exact solution of Schrodinger's equation for the hydrogen atom was an important milestone in my formation as a fundamentalist, by which he means he's the kind of guy who thinks that there are fundamental laws that apply everywhere and all when. I had never before been, and still was not, happy with quantum mechanics overall as a candidate fundamental theory. At a minimum, such theories should allow a coherent interpretation, and QM falls down badly on that front. Nevertheless, it offers us a well-defined differential equation, and at least clearly says This mathematical law governs the structure of matter. When you work through the exact solution of the hydrogen atom, you see that in some very important sense, at least, this claim has to be right. The existence of a stable state in which the proton and electron are bound to each other spatially, yet never collapse as one would classically expect, falls out beautifully from the solutions of the equation. Oops. What is particularly salient about the hydrogen solution is that its achievements transparently flow from the solution of an equation and from nothing else. From the 1930s onwards, our understanding of hydrogen has been and will be based on a mathematical equation. So what Hafer is doing here is expressing some of the phenomenology that goes with explanation in science. It seems, when scientists get it right, it seems utterly compelling. I can relate to this as a science, when I was a science student and so on. I'm not sure that I've ever had a similar experience in metaphysics. The explanations are just not that compelling. You can kind of see how you could assume that and get this out, but somehow there's some, for me at least, I have never had that experience of the explanations being as completely compelling as they are in science. And I think that invites the question, or is maybe a little bit of data for how it is that these explanations in the two contexts, including metaphysical explanations, right, are different. And that's really my concern. I mean, I don't have a dog in this fight about pluralism or whatever. Like, all my work is about demarcation. All of my work is understanding what is science, what is metaphysics. I think they're both important, but I think they're both and similar in some respects, but fundamentally different in other respects. And that's why I'm interested in this question. And I'd be very interested to hear what you had to think about that latter thought. Okay, it's not, I know it was a bit of a downer to end on, but maybe it's, I don't know, it's worth thinking about. So that's me. I just want to say very quickly, and we'll be able to say more of this at the end, but just a huge, huge thank you. I know some of you are here, to everybody on the program committee, and especially also my colleagues in the SMS, Alistair Wilson and Tyler Hildebrand, for putting in so much work to make this happen. You are my heroes. Thank you very much.